I'd invite you to open with me to the book of Daniel. I want to spend just a few moments here this morning. The book of Daniel was written in a period where the people of Israel were facing difficulties. Of course, they've been carried off into Babylonian captivity, and this is one of the first waves of the captivity taking place. And so you find Daniel among those who are the young men, the ones who are the capable young men. We might call them strapping young men in our day. Those are the first ones that were taken, and the goal of the king is to try and assimilate them into the Babylonian culture, make Babylonians out of them. And so we find a lot of the things described in the first chapter to that end, where they are appointed some of the king's delicacies and are taught the language of the Chaldeans and onward. And we see Daniel standing firm in his faith in rejection of that. And then we find some of the difficulties that Daniel and his friends face throughout the remainder of at least the first half of the book, where Daniel records a lot of the historical events that take place as this captivity has begun. I mentioned the other day that I don't say this to be an alarmist either. Difficult times are coming. As our society grows worse and worse and worse, our lives are going to become more and more difficult as we seek to walk in the Lord. And we're already starting to see that somewhat, mostly from the campaigns that we find, whether it be the media or various other things, the campaigns against our Christian values that are being derided and being mocked openly before us. And so when we find stories like the book of Daniel, among others, it helps us to remind us of some of the people of faith who in their time demonstrated and maintained their faith even in the midst of trials, and it can strengthen and give us the resolve to do the very same thing. I think that's much the point that you find in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. Of course, as he says just before that, he is encouraging them to endure in their faith so that they can receive what was promised after they have done the will of God. And so he gives examples of people who did that very thing, endured in faith, and then have gone on to receive what was promised. And so I want to think about the trials of faith that we might deal with, and really the trial by fire that may come as we seek to serve the Lord, and the resistance from those in the world around us. One of the great things that we see in the book of Daniel is the faith that is found with Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. At least that's their Chaldean names. Their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they are in the area when King Nebuchadnezzar sets up a golden image that is 60 cubits high. It says its width 6 cubits. He sets it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Chapter 3 and verse 1 tells us. I don't know what caused him to want to do this, but he decides to create this image, and what he wants is for the people to bow down and to worship it. Now remember, in the first chapter, these people are brought in, and he's trying to assimilate them into the Babylonian culture, and he's hoping that this will be just another way in which they can be just like us. And it says in verse 2 that Nebuchadnezzar the king sent forward to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, and judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they were standing before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so the herald loudly calls out, "To you it is said, O peoples, nations, and men of every tongue, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Up to that point, I think there's really not really that big of a deal going on. He's just set up this image. Well, big deal. Now it's a problem because he expects that we're going to play this music and we want everyone to bow down and to worship it. Naturally, that's going to be a problem for the people of God. Verse 6, whoever does not fall down to worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Well, not all the peoples, apparently. I don't know exactly how this took place, but I imagine the three men would have looked quite odd being the only ones standing up. It seems like most people would have noticed that at this point. But regardless, we find some of those come to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, or they say, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe with all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, do not pay attention to you, and they do not serve your gods, and do not worship the golden image which you have set up. And so, now they've been caught. Now they're going to be brought before the king, and they're going to have to face the consequences of their circumstances or situation. Consider the pressures that they would have regarding the king's decree here. The king has the power to end one's life for disobedience. And in fact, that's what he says he's going to do. If you don't obey me, I have this furnace right here, and we're going to toss you right on in if you don't obey. But then look around. All the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue fell down and worshiped the image. And they apparently were the only three that didn't. Everybody else is doing it. That's a lot of pressure, right? If everybody else is doing it. There was a social experiment that was done in a doctor's office that there was a beeping noise. And it was purely for the case of this experiment. And there was somebody that was planted in there, and every time this beep came up, they would stand up and then sit right back down. And then later on, this beep happened again, and then they stood up and would sit right back down. And people started to catch on, and they didn't know anything that was going on. And so to not be left out, they would stand up and sit down. And when the original people who were the planted ones had left, and really they were the only ones, when the beep sounded, they would stand up and they would sit back down. What that illustrated is the fact that people don't want to be different. They don't want to stand out. But our faith is going to call us to stand out sometimes. Our faith is going to call us to be different. And in fact, it takes great strength to be different. You find in the book of John, chapter 12, verses 42 and 43, it says that many of the rulers believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing Him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the glory of men rather than the glory of God. And what that illustrates, what that experiment illustrates, is that people just want to fit in and go along, and that's exactly what these rulers were doing, is they were fitting in, going along with the crowd, lest they be put out. And the implication then, or the reality is, they were more concerned with the glory of men than they were the glory of God. If we are going to be faithful to God, then we have to be more concerned with the approval of God rather than the approval of men. Our faith is going to put us at odds sometimes, like it did there with the Pharisees. And the reality is, so be it. Romans 12 verse 2 talks about not being conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may approve what the will of God is. It takes a great deal of courage to be different, to strength, to live that transformed life when nobody around you is. And so the question is then, if we are in this circumstance, would we have the courage to stand firm for our faith and to boldly defy the king, as we're about to read once again that the three men did? I do appreciate that there is a great deal of pressure on these men. But that pressure was not enough to cause them to compromise their faith. And so we will go back to Daniel 3 and continue on with the story. So the men have tattled on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They've told them, "These men did not bow to you, O king. They broke your decree." Verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar in rage and wrath said to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you are not serving my gods and do not worship the gold image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe with all kinds of music, then you shall fall down and worship the golden image which you have made." I think what he's essentially doing is we're going to give you another chance. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe they thought they saw something different. We're going to give you another chance. We're going to go ahead and play the music right now. And if you go ahead and bow, then we'll act like this never happened. You can go on your merry way. We'll just sweep it right under the carpet and we'll go on with our day. But if you do not worship, you will be immediately cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. And what God is there who can save you out of my hands? That's a really arrogant statement, is it not? Who's the God that's going to spare you? And think about this from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective as well. I think you can kind of somewhat understand where he's coming from. Nebuchadnezzar has just taken captive these people from the nation of Israel. And so if their God was worth anything, why did he allow them to be taken off into captivity, right? That's probably the kind of thinking that Nebuchadnezzar is thinking. I've already brought you captive. Where was your God then? Where's he going to be now? Well, what he doesn't realize is God is the one who appointed him to take them captive. This is all part of God's plan. And so, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to respond to you with an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to save us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will save us out of your hand, O king." I love verse 18. "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden image that you have set up." The three demonstrated a great deal of faith. Even in the midst of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is arrogantly boasting of his power, "I'm going to throw you into the furnace, and who's going to spare you? Who do you think is going to save you from my hand?" And so they boldly say, we don't need to give you an answer. Our God is going to save us. We have confidence in him. We firmly believe that when we remain faithful to him, he will save us out of your hand. But even if he doesn't, we'd rather die than worship your golden image. We're not going to bow down. Such defiance in the face of adversity. And this is good defiance, not the kind of defiance that we refuse to do what God says. This is defiance to the unlawlessness, the ungodliness that is before them. We will not bow our knee. Would we be willing to stand up against our governor in such a way? I mean, think about from their perspective. Maybe they might have reasoned amongst themselves, what's it going to hurt just this once? If we just do it this once, maybe we can repent later, right? Maybe we can ask God to forgive us later. If not, we're going to die, and what good are we to God dead, right? Well, maybe they hadn't, obviously it hadn't been written yet what we find about Abel, speaking better things than the blood of Abel. Their death can speak a lot of good, actually. But maybe they would reason, what good are we to God dead? Whatever reasoning we might have, whatever reason we might have for shrinking back, certainly didn't stop these three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In fact, they expressed their faith and their confidence in the power of God and in the faithfulness of God to save them. And even if God chose for some reason not to spare them, they were not going to surrender their faithfulness to Him. And I don't know what the future is going to hold, but maybe we're going to be in a place like this, where we do have those who are in charge of us, pressuring us to bow the knee to whatever it may be as opposed to God. We need to remember that God will spare us. Maybe not physically, but He will bless us and He will provide. And so they declared their great faith in God. We need to have that same boldness in our faith. We're going to keep trusting Him, whether or not it all works out. I think one of the things with this story is it illustrates that faith is not just trusting that it's all going to work out. I think that's what we often think is our faith, we have just confidence that somehow, some way, God's just going to work it all out, just like He did with Abraham. He tells Abraham that I want you to sacrifice your son, and then somehow, some way, we're still going to get to the end. It did work out in that case, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't. We read in the New Testament of people who gave their lives for the sake of the gospel. It doesn't always work out. But faith means that I'm going to continue to trust in God and I'm going to continue to be faithful to Him even when it doesn't work out. And so even when we're threatened, we must have the same boldness as we declare our faith and faithfulness to God. Luke chapter 9 and in verse 26, in the context of Jesus saying that we must take up our cross and follow Him, if anyone wishes to come after me, verse 23, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. And then He says in verse 26, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of the Son of Man will be ashamed of Him when He comes in His glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Being ashamed of Jesus is not just literally being ashamed. It's the idea of shrinking back in our faith when difficulties come. It's the description there in the parable of the sower of the one who's in the stony ground, and when the persecutions and the trials of life come, they shrink back, become unfruitful. Jesus says, if you're ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of you. In Hebrews 11 and in verse 26, going back to the examples of faithfulness here in this chapter, we find said regarding Moses, he regarded the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. He regarded the reproach that comes from following Jesus, that's associated with following Jesus, greater than all the treasures that he had available to him in Egypt, because he knew that there was a better reward. And the reality is, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have saved themselves from some physical distress at this point. They could have accepted the treasures of Babylon, and they could have been spared from a bit of torment, but they would have been denying God in the process. And the point is they chose to suffer reproach because they knew that there was something better that God could give them. And what God could give them was far better than anything, far better in greatness than anything that Nebuchadnezzar could do to them. And so they stood firm in their faith. And so we find their faith being tested. And so the king, in his fury then, in verse 19, he says he was filled with wrath, and the image of his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he answered and said to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, obviously, he doesn't have like a thermostat, and we normally set it to 200 degrees, and we're going to set it to 1400 this time. He wants to get it as hot as he possibly can get it. You make it so hot. And it was so hot, in fact, those who were casting them into the furnace were killed. And so they find themselves in the fire. In the fiery furnace, their faith has brought them into the midst of the fire. Sometimes our faith is going to be tested just that way. And I think in the future more so than it ever has been. And so Christians are going to face testing. We already do face periods of certain testing of different kinds. But the book of James tells us that we should count it joy when we fall into various trials. Knowing, he says, that the testing of your faith brings about perseverance. The testing of your faith can cause something greater in you, some kind of great character within you. In 1 Peter 1, and as Peter is describing the inheritance, the blessings of hope that we have, because of the inheritance, he says in verse 6 of 1 Peter chapter 1, "In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials." I think there's a lot of perspective there. Number one, he's saying greatly rejoice, exactly as James said. Even though now for a little while, it's temporary, you have been grieved by various trials. Verse 7, "So that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So you think about the way that gold is purified. You have a chunk of earth that's thrown into this furnace, and the dross, I think they call it, is melted or is taken away, and what's left is purified gold. And he's saying that your faith being tested is like the purification of the gold, and it's more precious than gold, your faith, your faithfulness. And so it is tested by fire so that we can enjoy the blessings of Christ at the end. In chapter 4, he goes on later on to say, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you." That's just the course of faithful people. "But to the degree you are sharing in the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exaltation." Peter is a letter, 1 Peter, is a letter that's being written to encourage them because trials are coming. And again, I think books like 1 Peter and Hebrews and others are going to be far more meaningful to us in the coming years because of the nature of what they are writing about, of the sufferings that they speak of, and the fact that there's answers for those things. He says these testings are going to come upon you, and it's not some strange thing. It's going to happen to faithful people, but you're sharing in the sufferings of Christ, and you're going to be rewarded when He is exalted. You're going to share in His exaltation. You're going to share in His glory. And so how would we stand in the shoes of these three men? Would we stand just as boldly and defiantly in the face of the king as they did? Would we be willing to stand firm as they did and allow our faith to be tested, knowing that there is a reward waiting for us? I think the reality is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know for certain what was going to happen. They had confidence God can save us, and we think He will. But maybe not. And if not, that's okay too. We know there's a reward for our faithfulness. But we do know the story, the rest of the story, as they say. And we find the victory of their faith. they were spared in the burning fiery furnace. And so, we find in verse 22, for this reason, because the king's word was urgent and the furnace had been heated up to an extraordinary degree, the flame of the fire killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of fire, a blazing fire still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and hurriedly stood up. And he answered and said to the high officials, was it not three men we cast tied up into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to him, certainly, O king. These were the wise men. And he answered and said, look, I see four men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he answered and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, your servants of the Most High God, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. Then the satraps, prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no power over the bodies of these men, nor the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Who is the God who can deliver you from my hand? He says, well, let me introduce myself. Let me show you who I am. In the book of Exodus, we find the people of Israel have gone down into the land of Egypt. And the Pharaoh that did not know Joseph became fearful of them, and so he is beginning to oppress them lest they rise up and overtake us. And when Moses is sent to deliver them from their oppression, God tells them He's not going to listen. He's not going to listen to you. He's not going to let the people go, but I will demonstrate my power to the people of Egypt. I will demonstrate my mighty hand, and with my mighty hand I will deliver my people. In that case, God had orchestrated all this to say, I'm going to demonstrate my power. In this case, God had opportunity to demonstrate His power and to show who He is because of the faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, let me emphasize once again, when we stand up in faith, God's not going to introduce Himself today like He did then. We can't expect God to spare us from the burning fiery furnace. God's not going to perform. God doesn't act miraculously in the way that He did back then. But that doesn't mean that deliverance is still not available to us. I think we can see that God will continue to be with His people. We find in Isaiah 43, and beginning in verse 1, it reads here, now, thus says Yahweh, your Creator, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through rivers they will not overflow you. When you walk through fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. It's God's promise to His people, and when they are faithful to Him, He will spare them. That's exactly what happened in the book of, or into the people of Daniel, into Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I'm kind of getting a little bit mixed up on the timeline here. I believe Isaiah would be prior to the fall of Babylon. Warning about it coming, of course, but prior to it. And so maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were familiar with the words of Isaiah, and they knew that God would be with them. But at the end of the day, we find that Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges God because of the faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says in verse 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and He saved His servants who put their trust in Him, violating the king's word, and gave up their bodies so as to not serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. And I want to emphasize once again that Nebuchadnezzar never, ever would have come to know that had it not been for the faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego on this occasion. And so, our faith can provide opportunity for even the Gentiles to speak well of God. We find important the importance of respecting and honoring and fearing God so that others can come to respect and honor and fear God themselves. We find in Hebrews 11 verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who draws near to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. I think you see that illustrated in the story there of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He is a rewarder of those who sought Him. They were faithful to Him, and He was faithful to them and to His Word. If we back up to the Psalms, in Psalm 34 and in verse 7, in Psalm 34 and in verse 7, it says here, the angel of Yahweh encamps around those who fear Him, and He rescues them. Now this would have been well before Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were ever in this position. But David says that the angel of Yahweh encamps around those who fear Him, and He rescues them. Verse 8, taste and see that Yahweh is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in Him. Later on, he says in verse 17, verse 15, the eyes of Yahweh are toward the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. At verse 17, righteous cry, and Yahweh hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. Again, speaking to the faithfulness of God and the fact that He's going to reward those who are faithful to Him. And then we find Romans 8 in verse 31 as Paul is describing really the victory that we have in Jesus, as he describes us as more than conquerors. He says in verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? And then he goes on to describe who will separate us from the love of Christ. Will affliction or turmoil or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Just as it is written, for your sake we are being put to death all day long. We were counted as sheep for the slaughter. But in all these things we are overwhelmingly conquering through Him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life nor angels nor rulers nor things present nor things to come nor powers nor height nor depth nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. God is going to reward those who stand for Him, and if He is for us, no one can stand against us. But I also want to emphasize Matthew 5 and verse 16, where Jesus calls upon us to shine our lights before men so that they may see our good works and glorify our Father who is in heaven. We see Nebuchadnezzar speaking good of God. Now, I don't think that this means that Nebuchadnezzar became a believer and a faithful servant of God, and now we can expect that we're going to see him in heaven. I don't think that's the reality. I think at bare minimum, we do see him recognizing that there is a powerful God, and that's the God of these people. And he never would have known that if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego hadn't shined their light. And what Jesus is saying is we shine our light so that others can see the hope that we have. So that others can see something different, something better. I believe I may have mentioned this before, but I've heard the story, this was years ago, of a woman who every day when she was on her lunch break, she would go to a Subway, and she was always really friendly with the employees, and she would sit down and eat her meal while reading her Bible. And one day somebody came in or somebody was working there who was just really in a struggle. And the worker said, "Why don't you go talk to her?" And so she did. And eventually she became a Christian. And at the time that story was told, she was a faithful member of the Lord's church where she was. Because somebody was shining her light to those around her, and somebody was seeking something better than what they were living. We must not take for granted the power of our example. The world around us is craving something. The world that's filled with broken homes and filled with emptiness because they've rejected the one who can fill them are searching for something. And if we're just right along with them in the emptiness, what are we showing them? But if we show them the hope, the joy, and the peace that we have in Jesus, even while the world is falling apart around us, they're going to see something in us. And they're going to want to know where that peace comes from. And that provides us the opportunity to open up the Scriptures and say, this is the God of peace. And this is how you can know Him. And this is how you can serve Him. And this is how you too can enjoy that very same peace. And so we need to make sure that if the opportunity arises for us to shine our light in such a way, Nebuchadnezzar only knew God because they took a stand for Him. As the song The World's Bible says, we are the only Bible this careless world will read. There are some people who the only way that they'll ever know the truth of the gospel is for us to shine the light forth. Then ask the question, what if the type is crooked? What if the print is blurred? Let's make sure that our faith is strong enough to cause us to live counterculturally so that others can see the hope of Christ in us. But then finally, I do want to point out that despite the circumstances, God's law does not change. Exodus chapter 20 verse 3 says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And it doesn't matter that they're standing right around the fiery furnace that is being warmed up and it's being heated far more than it ever was heated before. It doesn't change the fact that we shall have no other gods before the Lord. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego recognized that fact, and they were willing to die in their faithfulness to Him, knowing the law of God and the fact that it doesn't change. We're inevitably going to face trials. The Bible tells us that those who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. Jesus tells us that those who the world hates us because it hated Him first. And you kind of see that around us, especially with all this uproar that's going on around the Olympics that are taking place. You notice that it's only Christians that are really being mocked in their faith, not these other religions. And we know why. Because the world hates Jesus, because it hates the light that He brings. And so we must learn from the example of these three men to have the same faith that they had, to be able to stand in our faith so that we can gain the victory and that we can hopefully shine the light to those around us so that they can see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. And so let's maintain boldness in our faith, ready to stand against the wiles of the devil so that we can enjoy the blessings that come from our faithfulness to Him. If you have been faithful to God, and if your faith is strong and you're ready to stand firm, then keep pressing on. But let me suggest that your brethren need you. Your brethren need you to strengthen their faith so that we can all increase our faith, and so that when these trials come, we can be ready. And like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we can stand in the face of adversity, stand before the king and say, we don't need to answer you because our God will deliver us. And even if not, we will not serve other gods. If there's any way in which we can help you in strengthening your faith, in any way it may need it, we're here to stand with you, to walk with you, to pray with you, to encourage you in any way we can so that we can all work together, walk together towards that heavenly home that our Lord has promised us. Jesus has provided us or given us an invitation to draw us to come to Him, to take advantage of the spiritual blessings that He has made available. He said, I've claimed victory, and I'm going to claim the ultimate victory. And if you're faithful to me, if you're on my side, you will share in that victory. If there's any way in which you need to respond to that invitation and you need to take advantage of those blessings so that you can share in that victory, we'd be glad to help you. We'd be glad to encourage you in any way. Whatever spiritual need you may have, if you need to respond to our Lord's invitation, we bid you to come as we stand and sing together.